The room was silent except for the slow, mechanical beeping of a heart monitor. Pale hospital lights reflected off white walls, making the space feel colder than it really was. Outside the glass window, the city moved like nothing was wrong. Cars passing, lights blinking, life continuing. But inside this room, time felt frozen. On the bed lay Keanu Reeves. No cameras, no fans, no red carpets. Just a man motionless beneath thin white sheets, tubes running from his arms, his face calm but dangerously still. A nurse adjusted the IV and glanced at the monitor again, her expression tightening for just a second longer than professional rules allowed. "He hasn't responded," she whispered to another nurse. "If there's no change soon," she didn't finish the sentence. Word had already spread quietly through the hospital. A global star was here, but no one was celebrating. Doctors spoke in careful tones. Security stood outside the door, not to control crowds. There were none, but to protect the silence. Visiting hours were almost over, and the staff prepared to clear the room. That's when one man stepped forward. No suit, no entourage, no badge that carried power. Just a worn jacket, tired eyes, and a face marked by years of shared memories. He stood at the doorway, hands clenched, listening to the sound of the machines like they were counting down something he wasn't ready to lose. "I'm staying," he said quietly. The nurse hesitated. "Sir, only family." "I know," he replied, his voice steady but heavy. "But he doesn't have anyone else right now." For a moment, no one spoke. The beeping filled the space again. Finally, the nurse nodded and stepped aside. The door closed softly behind him, sealing the room from the world outside. The man walked slowly to the bedside and sat down. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He just looked at Keanu the same way he had years ago, not as a star, not as a legend, but as a friend. "I told you I'd be here," he whispered, leaning closer. "No matter what." He reached into his bag and pulled something out, holding it tightly in his hands. Something from the past. Something that carried a promise made long before fame, before loss, before this hospital room. What this man was about to do next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But by morning, everyone in that hospital, and everyone who would later hear this story, would understand one thing clearly. True friendship doesn't show up when life is easy. It shows up when everything is on the line. Long before the hospital room, before the quiet beeping machines and whispered worries, Keanu Reeves had lived a life the world thought it understood. To most people, he was the calm face on movie posters, the man who carried action films with silence instead of swagger. Fame followed him everywhere, but it never seemed to touch him the way it touched others. Behind that public image was a man shaped by loss. Years ago, Keanu had learned how quickly life could take everything away. Family tragedies came one after another, leaving spaces that never fully healed. While others chased noise to escape pain, he chose stillness, empty apartments, long walks alone, simple meals, quiet generosity that rarely made headlines. People admired him, but few truly knew him. Success made him recognizable, but it also made his world smaller. Friends from earlier days faded as schedules grew heavier and attention became dangerous. Industry smiles came with expectations. Conversations turned into transactions. Somewhere along the way, the circle around him shrank, until only one person remained who never asked for anything in return. That man was the same one now sitting beside his hospital bed. They had known each other long before fame complicated everything. Back when dreams were uncertain and promises were simple. When success was just a possibility, not a weight. While others drifted away as Keanu's name grew larger, this friend stayed exactly the same. Same honesty, same loyalty, same presence. He never worked in films, never benefited from the spotlight. He watched from the sidelines as Keanu's life unfolded in public, always close enough to help, never close enough to be noticed. When the call came in the middle of the night, he didn't hesitate. No press, no announcements. He drove straight to the hospital, sitting through the long hours without sleep, ignoring questions he didn't care to answer. Lawyers had been notified. Assistants had been informed. But none of them were here yet. Just him. Outside the room, doctors spoke quietly, careful with every word. The situation was serious. They couldn't promise anything. Inside, the machines continued their steady rhythm, indifferent to fame or fortune. The friend watched Keanu's chest rise and fall, remembering conversations they'd once had about life, about how fragile everything really was. Keanu had always believed that real wealth wasn't money or awards. It was people who stayed when nothing was guaranteed. Now, that belief was being tested. The friend leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pressing down on him, but he didn't move. He had already made up his mind. No matter how long the night lasted, no matter what happened next, he wouldn't leave. Because some bonds don't need blood to be real, and some promises don't expire, even when everything else does. As the night deepened, the calm inside the hospital began to fracture. Doctors returned in pairs now, their voices lower, their expressions tighter. Charts were reviewed again and again, as if numbers might change simply by being watched closely. One physician stood near the foot of the bed, arms folded, eyes fixed on the monitor. Another adjusted a setting, then stepped back, exhaling slowly. "We're doing everything we can," he said, careful with each word. "But the next few hours are critical." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and unfinished. Outside the room, the hallway filled with quiet tension. Security shifted positions. A hospital administrator whispered urgently into a phone. Somewhere down the corridor, an elevator opened and closed, carrying people who had no idea how close this room was to something irreversible. Not long after, others arrived. A man in a tailored coat. A woman holding a tablet tight against her chest. Another voice asking questions that had nothing to do with breathing or heartbeats. They spoke about schedules, contracts, obligations. About what needed to be prepared, just in case. The friend stepped out into the hallway, placing himself between them and the door. "Only family is allowed," someone said, glancing at him dismissively. "He doesn't have family here," the friend replied. "He has me." The woman sighed, clearly irritated. "Sir, we understand you're close, but we need to think about what happens next." "What happens next," he said calmly, "is that he's not alone." Security looked to the nurse for guidance. The nurse hesitated, then shook her head slightly. The door stayed closed. Back inside the room, the friend sat again, closer this time. He watched the monitor, counting beats without realizing it. Every dip in the rhythm felt personal, like a warning meant only for him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and spoke softly. "Hey," he said as if Keanu could hear him clearly. "You always hated hospitals. Said they smelled like endings." He paused, swallowing hard. "You said if anything ever happened, you didn't want a crowd. No noise. Just someone who remembered you before all of this." The machines answered with a steady beep. Hours passed like this, slow, unforgiving. The friend's phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket. He ignored it. Outside, voices grew sharper, more impatient. Someone knocked once, then again. "Sir, visiting hours ended a long time ago," a guard said through the door. "We're going to have to ask you to leave." The friend stood, opening the door just enough to step into the hallway. "No," he said quietly. The guard frowned. "Sir," I said no. There was no anger in his voice, no threat, just certainty. For a moment it looked like they might force the issue. Then the heart monitor inside the room spiked sharply. An alarm sounded, sudden and shrill. Doctors rushed past them, pushing the door open fully as they moved to the bed. The friend was pushed back against the wall as medical staff worked quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. Instructions were shouted. Equipment moved. Time collapsed into noise and motion. Then, just as suddenly, the alarm softened. The room steadied again. The doctor turned, removing his gloves. His face said enough. "He's still with us," he said. "But it's unstable." The hallway went quiet. The friend returned to the bedside once more. His hands trembled now just slightly. He reached into his bag, fingers brushing against something he had carried with him for years, always telling himself he'd never need it. But the truth was, he had always known this moment might come. He pulled the object out slowly and held it in his hands, staring at it like it held both hope and regret. Whatever happened next would change everything, not just for Keanu, but for him as well. And for the first time that night, fear finally caught up with him. Not fear of loss, fear of what he was about to do, and what it would cost. The hospital room felt different after that moment. Not louder, not calmer. Just heavier, as if the air itself had absorbed everything that had been said, everything that might still happen. The machines returned to their steady rhythm, but no one trusted the sound anymore. Every beep felt temporary. The friend remained standing for a long moment, the object still in his hands. He hadn't planned to take it out yet. Not like this, not now. But once it was there, he couldn't pretend anymore. He slowly lowered himself back into the chair beside the bed, his movements careful, almost respectful, like he didn't want to disturb whatever fragile balance was holding Keanu in place. He looked at Keanu's face, pale, peaceful, unaware of the quiet battle happening around him. It was strange how still he looked. The same man who had spent years running, fighting, surviving on screen now lay completely motionless, depending on machines and chance. The friend exhaled slowly and opened his hand. Inside were a few folded pages, worn at the edges, creased from being carried too long, handwritten. Old. He ran his thumb over the paper before unfolding the first one, as if asking permission. "You probably don't remember this," he said softly, his voice barely louder than the machine's. "But I do." He began to read. The words were simple, honest. Written years ago when life had been uncertain and nothing was guaranteed. They spoke of hope, of fear, of promises made without knowing if they would ever be tested. As he read, his voice steadied, guided by memory more than sound. Outside the room, a nurse slowed her steps and paused. She didn't mean to listen, but the calm in his voice held her there. A doctor passing by stopped too, recognizing something familiar, not fame, not tragedy, but sincerity. The friend read another page, then another. Between the lines, he spoke directly to Keanu. He reminded him of long walks taken without destination, of late-night conversations about what really mattered, about how Keanu had once said that people reveal who they are when no one is watching. You lived like that? The friend continued, even when it would have been easier not to. His voice wavered for the first time. He paused, gathering himself, then leaned closer to the bed. I'm not here because of who you became, he whispered. I'm here because of who you always were. The heart monitor flickered slightly. Not enough to cause alarm. Enough to be noticed. The nurse exchanged a glance with the doctor. Neither said anything. The friend folded the pages carefully and set them on the bedside table. Then he reached into his bag again, slower this time, more deliberate. He removed something else, smaller, heavier, wrapped carefully like it had been protected for years. He held it up, letting the dim light catch it. This, he said, almost to himself, was never supposed to come out like this. He explained quietly, not in detail, not dramatically, just enough. About a choice made long ago. About stepping back so someone else could move forward. About a sacrifice that had never been mentioned because it didn't need applause. As he spoke, the room seemed to shrink. The world outside the hospital faded. Even the machines felt distant now, like background noise to something more important. Keanu's breathing shifted, just slightly. A small change, almost imperceptible. The doctor leaned in, eyes narrowing, watching closely. The friend noticed it too. His breath caught in his chest. He stopped speaking, afraid that even his voice might interrupt whatever was happening. Seconds passed. Then another subtle movement, finger, barely twitching beneath the sheet. The nurse inhaled sharply. Did you see that? She whispered. The doctor nodded, already stepping closer. Let's stay calm. The friend didn't move, he didn't speak. He just watched. Hope and fear tangled so tightly inside him that he couldn't tell them apart. A tear slipped down his face, silent and unacknowledged. He wiped it away quickly, embarrassed by the instinct, then leaned forward again. I'm still here, he said quietly. Just like I promised. The machines continued their rhythm, steady but no longer empty. Something had shifted. Not enough to declare victory. Not enough to erase the danger, but enough to change the room. Enough to make everyone present believe that this night wasn't finished yet, and whatever came next would not be faced alone. The doctor asked everyone to remain still. No sudden movements, no raised voices, just quiet attention, the kind of silence that feels active, as if the room itself is listening. The monitor continued its rhythm, steady but cautious, like it wasn't ready to promise anything yet. The friend stayed seated, his hands resting flat on his knees now. He didn't want to reach out again. He didn't want to rush whatever fragile moment had begun. Years of knowing Keanu had taught him one thing well: some things only move forward when you let them. Minutes passed. Then the doctor spoke, barely above a whisper. There's a response. It's small, but it's real. The nurse nodded, eyes never leaving the screen. His body's reacting. The friend closed his eyes for a brief second, not in relief, but in resolve. Because what he was about to do had nothing to do with hope alone. It was something he had decided on long before this night ever existed. He reached for the item he had unwrapped earlier and placed it gently on the bedside table, next to the folded letters. He turned it so it faced the light, making sure it could be seen clearly. This is the part I never told you, he said softly, directing the words toward Keanu, even though his eyes stayed open. Not because it was a secret, but because it didn't matter until now. He explained slowly, choosing his words with care. Years ago, before the fame fully arrived, before the world began pulling Keanu in 100 directions at once, there had been a moment, a single turning point, an opportunity that could only go to one of them, a door that would close forever once it opened. The friend had stepped back, not because he wasn't capable, not because he didn't want it, but because he knew what it meant to Keanu. He knew what Keanu carried inside him: the weight of loss, the need to create, the quiet drive to move forward even when life kept taking things away. I told myself it was temporary, he continued. That life would balance itself out. It never did. The opportunity grew into a career. The career became a legacy. And Keanu never knew the full truth, that someone else had absorbed the cost so he could move freely. The friend leaned forward slightly now, his voice steady but worn. I didn't regret it, he said, not once. But I promised myself that if you ever needed me, really needed me, I'd give everything again, without hesitation. He slid a document from the bag and placed it beside the others. Signed, final, no conditions attached. The nurse glanced at it, then at the doctor. Their expressions shifted, surprise mixed with disbelief. "You're sure?" the doctor asked quietly, not as a professional question, but as a human one. The friend nodded. "I've been sure for years." As if responding to the sound of his voice, Keanu's breathing deepened. Not dramatically, just enough to be different. The monitor reflected the change, its rhythm gaining a subtle strength. Then, unmistakably, Keanu's hand moved. Not a twitch this time. A deliberate, slow curl of the fingers. The nurse stepped forward, hand over her mouth. "Keanu," she said gently. His eyelids fluttered. Once. Twice, then stopped. The friend stood up without realizing he was doing it. His chair scraped softly against the floor, the sound too loud in the moment. He froze, afraid he'd ruined everything. Seconds passed. Then Keanu's eyes opened. Just a fraction at first, unfocused and confused, like someone waking from a long, heavy dream. His gaze drifted, searching, struggling to understand where he was. The machines beeped a little faster now, not in alarm, but in recognition. The doctor moved in immediately, checking vitals, calling for additional staff. But the friend didn't look away. He couldn't. He stepped closer, stopping just short of touching the bed. "Hey," he said quietly, voice breaking despite his effort. "Easy. You're okay. You're here." Keanu's eyes shifted toward the sound. They landed on the friend's face and stayed there. For a moment there was no recognition, just confusion. Then something changed. A flicker, a breath caught halfway in his chest. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. "It's okay," the friend said quickly. "Don't talk. Just stay." A tear slid from the corner of Keanu's eye, slow and unguarded. His fingers tightened weakly against the sheets. The doctor looked at the monitor again, then back at Keanu. "He's responding well," he said. "This doesn't mean we're out of danger yet, but it means he's fighting." The friend finally exhaled fully, like he'd been holding his breath for years instead of hours. He reached out now, carefully, and rested his hand over Keanu's, not gripping, not demanding. "Just present. You're not alone," he said softly. "You never were." The room, once filled with uncertainty, now held something else. Not relief, not victory, truth. And sometimes, that's what it takes to bring someone back. Morning light slowly crept through the narrow hospital window, softening the harsh glow that had ruled the room all night. The machines were still there, still humming and beeping, but their rhythm felt steadier now, less fragile, less uncertain. Nurses moved in and out quietly, checking numbers, adjusting settings, exchanging looks that carried cautious optimism. Keanu Reeves was awake. Not fully alert, not strong, but present. His eyes opened more often now, lingering longer each time. Confusion came and went in waves, but one thing remained constant. His gaze kept returning to the same place. The chair beside his bed, the man who hadn't left. The friend noticed it every time. Each glance felt heavier than words, like Keanu was trying to remember something important, something just out of reach. When their eyes met, the friend would nod gently, grounding him without asking anything in return. "You're in the hospital," he said softly, repeating it as many times as needed. "You're safe. Just rest." Doctors explained the situation in careful terms. There had been complications. Recovery wouldn't be quick. There would be days, maybe weeks, before they could say anything with certainty. But Keanu had stabilized. His body had responded. Against the odds, he was still here. When the room finally cleared and the door closed again, silence returned, different now. Not heavy with fear, but weighted with truth. Keanu's voice came out hoarse and broken when he finally spoke. "You stayed." The friend leaned closer, offering a small smile. "Of course I did." Keanu swallowed, his eyes never leaving him. "They said you didn't have to." "I know," the friend replied. "I wanted to." A pause followed. Keanu's breathing slowed, his thoughts catching up piece by piece. His eyes drifted to the bedside table, the letters, the documents, the item placed so carefully beside them. "What's that?" he asked faintly. The friend didn't rush to answer. He sat back down and took a breath, the same way he had the night before. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Keanu listened as best he could, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, then to something deeper, recognition. The truth settled slowly like dust in sunlight. Every sacrifice, every quiet decision, every moment that had been given without acknowledgement. When the friend finished, the room went quiet again. Keanu's eyes filled, and this time he didn't look away. "You did all that for me." "For you," the friend said simply. "And because it was right." Keanu shook his head weakly, overwhelmed. "I didn't know. I didn't want you to," the friend replied. "You carried enough already." Tears came freely now, unguarded and human. Keanu reached out, his hand trembling as it searched the air. The friend took it carefully, like before, not holding too tight, not letting go. "I don't know how to repay you," Keanu whispered. The friend smiled softly. You don't have to. Later that day, when doctors allowed brief visits, people began to arrive. Executives, assistants. Familiar faces from a life that had been paused overnight. They spoke quietly, respectfully, keeping their distance. None of them interrupted the moment unfolding at the bedside. Keanu watched them come and go, then looked back at his friend. They were ready to plan everything, he said quietly. Before I was even awake. They always are, the friend replied. Keanu nodded slowly. That stops now. It wasn't said loudly. There was no announcement. Just a decision made with clarity born from proximity to loss. When the doctor returned, Keanu asked for privacy again. Papers were requested. Calls were delayed. For the first time in years, urgency was replaced with intention. Over the next few days, Keanu grew stronger. His voice steadied. His eyes sharpened. But what changed most wasn't physical. It was internal. He listened more. Spoke less. He watched people carefully, seeing not what they offered, but why they were there. One afternoon, he turned to his friend and said, I've spent my life being grateful in silence. I think it's time I did something different. The friend frowned slightly. You don't owe anyone anything. Keanu smiled faintly. I know. That's why I want to. Plans were made not for publicity, not for attention, but for correction. Quiet changes. Decisions that would ripple outward without noise. Support redirected. Priorities reshaped. People who had shown up when it mattered were brought closer. Those who hadn't slowly faded into the background. When Keanu was finally strong enough to sit by the window, watching the city again, he looked at his friend and said, You brought me back. The friend shook his head. You did that yourself? Maybe, Keanu replied, but I wouldn't have stayed without you. They sat in silence after that, the kind that doesn't need filling. Outside, life continued as it always had. But inside that room, something fundamental had shifted. Survival had turned into clarity, and clarity, Keanu realized, was the greatest gift of all. Recovery didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, in small moments that didn't make headlines. A steadier step down the hallway. A deeper breath without effort. A laugh that surprised everyone in the room, including Keanu himself. The danger had passed, but the experience had left something permanent behind. Not weakness, but awareness. Keanu spent a lot of time thinking during those final days in the hospital, not about movies, not about roles or projects waiting on hold, but about moments, about how close everything had come to ending without warning, about how many people had known his name, yet how few had truly known him. One night, as the city lights flickered outside the window, he said quietly, I used to believe kindness was something you practiced when life slowed down. The friend looked at him curious. Now I know, Keanu continued, it's what matters most when life speeds up. That understanding didn't come with speeches or dramatic gestures. It showed itself in choices. In who he led into the room. In who he trusted with silence instead of words. In how he measured success not by what he gained, but by what he was willing to give without being asked. He remembered all the times he'd been polite, generous, respectful, and realized something important. Those actions weren't impressive. They were necessary. Because respect isn't something you offer as a reward. It's something you give because the other person exists. What stayed with him most wasn't the machines, or the doctors, or the fear. It was the presence of one person who stayed when nothing was guaranteed. No contracts, no benefits, no future promises, just loyalty in its purest form. And that loyalty had changed everything. When Keanu was finally discharged, there was no announcement. No cameras waiting. He left the hospital the same way he had lived much of his life, quietly. The friend walked beside him, not ahead, not behind. Equal, unchanged. In the weeks that followed, people noticed something different. Not in how Keanu spoke, but in what he didn't say. He avoided noise. Declined attention. Stepped away from situations that felt hollow. When he did speak, it was measured, intentional, and honest. Those closest to him saw it clearly. He was no longer rushing, no longer proving, no longer carrying expectations that weren't his to bear. One afternoon, sitting on a bench watching the world move past, he said something that would later be repeated often, not because it was clever, but because it was true. The loudest people rarely hold the most power, he said. The quiet ones are usually the reason anything good survives. That lesson didn't belong only to him. It belonged to everyone who had ever been overlooked. To those who stayed kind in rooms where kindness wasn't returned. To people who chose integrity even when no one was watching. To friends who stayed long after convenience disappeared. Because real strength isn't dominance. It's restraint. Real wealth isn't accumulation. It's connection. And real power isn't control. It's presence. Keanu never framed the experience as a miracle. He called it a reminder. A reminder that life doesn't warn you before it changes. That status doesn't protect you. That money can't replace loyalty. and that the people who matter most are often the ones standing quietly beside you, asking for nothing. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this. Treat people with respect not because of who they are, but because of who you choose to be. Stay loyal even when it costs you something, and never underestimate the impact of simply being there. Because one day, when everything else falls away, that may be the only thing that truly matters. More meaningful stories like this are coming, stories about humanity, loyalty, and the quiet moments that define us far more than fame ever could. If this one stayed with you, share which part resonated most. Your feedback helps shape the stories that come next. And if you believe humility is real strength, you already understand the heart of this story.